Hello, everybody. Today I'm honored to introduce you to Jennifer Adler. Jennifer is a renowned nutritionist specializing in the treatment and prevention of eating disorders. She's founder of Passionate Nutrition and co-founder of the International Eating Disorders Institute. She holds a Master of Science in Clinical Nutrition and Counseling. And so now, without any further ado, the interview.
Why did you decide to become a nutritionist?
Well, it started, my mother developed breast cancer in her late 20s, so I grew up with illness. And I learned at a pretty young age that I was disillusioned with Western medicine, and I felt like there had to be another way for people to be healthy. And it seemed like it made sense to me that food is what's making up our body. And so what we eat can have a big impact on our overall health.
Have you come to the conclusion that through nutrition, cancers can be cured?
Well, I can never say that cancers can be cured. I would have, my door would get beat down. But I have seen where people can get much better, and that working through food can really impact people's cancer in a positive way.
Now, talk to me about why you decided to farm seaweed.
I love seaweed. Seaweed is really a miracle food as far as I'm concerned. I mean, if you take a pint of ocean water and if you take a pint of our blood, the mineral content is almost identical. So when we have something that comes from the ocean, like seaweed, it's loaded with the minerals that our body needs. And, especially, I got interested in it through looking at cancer specifically, and seaweed can be really helpful
Oh,
with
really?
cancer.
With cancer, too?
Yeah.
Now, have there been any scientific studies to substantiate that, Jennifer?
With cancer?
As far as the seaweed cancer relationship?
Yes, actually, looking at women of Japan, one of the theories as to why they have such a low incidence of breast cancer is because of the high iodine content of their diet. And a lot of that iodine comes from the seaweed that they're eating.
Yeah, so it's a good source of iodine.
Yeah, great source of iodine. So breast cancer, thyroid. Seaweed is incredible. And the other thing about seaweed too that I really like is that it's very sustainable. So
you can keep growing more of it.
Exactly. It's the fastest growing, like bulbous kelp, which is something that we harvest, is the fastest growing plant that there is. Some people say that it can grow up to 18 inches a day, which is amazing. But if you think about it, the kelp is in this nutrient-rich water, that's loaded with minerals. It's getting sunlight, because the kelp floats to the top. There's gases in there that make that happen. So it's just bathed in nutrition all the time. And especially being in colder waters like we have in the Pacific Northwest, it can grow really quickly. So if people know how to harvest seaweed sustainably, not only is it really good for our health, but it's also a sustainable food for our environment.
Does seaweed pick up toxins out of the water?
It does. You have to be careful as to where the seaweed is grown. You don't want to harvest near polluted areas. Like for where we live, anywhere south of Port Townsend isn't a good idea. You want to go north of that.
Where do you market your seaweed? Do you market it like to restaurants or?
We don't actually sell seaweed. What we do is we just teach the classes where we
how to grow it?
Not how to grow it, but what we do is we take people up to Lopez Island and we teach people how to harvest sustainably, to harvest seaweed from nature. And people go home with enough seaweed for years. It lasts them. I run into people years later and they say, I'm still eating seaweed. So that's what we do. It's more of an educational.
Oh, that they take it and then grow it themselves? Is that?
They don't grow it. We go out and harvest the seaweed, and then over the class we teach how to cook with it, how to dry it, how to pickle it, so that you have it for years after the class.
Oh.
Because seaweed doesn't go bad. Because what you're looking for is the minerals in the seaweed. So you can have seaweed that's 20 years old, and it's great. And, to go back to your question of do you have to be careful of where you harvest the seaweed from in terms of toxins, You do. I mean, one of the amazing things about seaweed is it binds to heavy metals and radiation in our body, and it helps to get rid of it. So it also does that in the ocean. So that's why it can be very helpful for us, because it helps to clear out some of the pollutants and the contaminants that we come in contact with. But we don't want to have the seaweed from polluted sources. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would make sense. But if it's binding to if it's binding to, say, mercury,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the problems that we have in the oceans right now,
Mm-hmm.
and that we're seeing show up in the fish, such as tuna, if it binds to, say, mercury,
Mm-hmm.
and someone were to eat the seaweed that's bound to mercury, would it release the mercury, or would it still be bound in chemical form, you know what I mean, and just be what it is?
I don't know this definitively. It seems like, just understanding how the body works and the seaweed, it seems like it would just be bound and get excreted, because that's what it does in the body, is pulls it out and excretes it.
That's what that's why I asked that question.
But I'm not entirely sure. But also things like heavy metals like mercury in the ocean, it's more concentrated as it goes higher up the food chain.
Oh yeah.
You know, so the larger the fish. So seaweed is still, it's going to be low in terms of levels.
Yeah, because it's kind of at the bottom of the food chain.
Right.
What everybody eats. The other question that I was going to ask you is, do you think it's a good idea for people to eliminate red meat from their diet?
I don't. I mean, I think that it's really, it depends on the source of the red meat. You know, red meat has gotten such a bad reputation, but it depends on where it's coming from. I mean, people have eaten red meat throughout history, but there's been some things that's changed. One, the quantity of red meat, and also how the animals are raised. So what people have eaten throughout history is red meat from 100% grass-fed animals. You know, it would be deer or elk or even cows that were roaming on pasture. So that's going to completely change the nutritional profile of that food. So for example, the essential fatty acids that are found in grass-fed meat are close to that of salmon. But the essential fatty acid content of feedlot meat, it's almost non-existent. You know, so it depends on the source of the red meat.
Gotcha. So you're not one of these adamant vegetarian or vegans?
No. I don't believe in extremes. And I also like to look at history. I like to look at how people have eaten throughout time. You know, what have people been eating for hundreds of thousands of years?
Do you think, this is kind of an aside question, but along the same lines, that the meat, or being a vegetarian, say, or some people really like their meat, there also might be some metabolic influences there, where some people are healthier with a higher protein diet than other people. Other people may be healthier with a much larger concentration of vegetables, say, and fruit.
Yeah, I agree. I don't believe that there's a one-size-fits-all with diet. I mean, that's the thing. Like at Passionate Nutrition, each client that comes in, we'll have a different recommendation for them based on, you know, what symptoms they have, what goals they have, what their constitution is like. It's very different for everyone. You know, there just isn't a one diet that is going to meet everyone's needs.
Do you do then, when in Compassionate Nutrition, do you do like workups, blood workups and so forth like that with people?
You know, we don't do blood work, but what we do is by asking enough questions and looking at the person, you can get a lot of information. I mean, labs and blood work is relatively new in the scheme of history, and also just as nutritionists, we're not able to draw labs. We can get lab results from doctors, but we have enough information for what we do in terms of food to be able to look at somebody and ask them a lot of questions to get a better sense of what could be a good match for them.
I read a book called Metabolic Typing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was why I asked you that question, because in that book he discusses you know, various diets for various people. Depends
Mhm.
on the person and how they metabolize food.
Mhm.
What, generally speaking, now I know I'm asking for a generality, which kind of goes flies in the face of what we were just discussing. Would you recommend to a person to feel his or her best?
Mhm. Well, that's a good question, and I guess I mean we do have at Passionate Nutrition we do have some core philosophies that we tend to follow in terms of eating more whole foods, closer to their source. For most people, eating regularly throughout the day, making sure people get enough protein, enough vegetables, enough fat, things like that can be really helpful. But then the portions, the quantities, it changes based on the person.
What's your view on, say, eating butter versus, say, olive oil?
Both. I mean, people have been eating butter and people have been eating olive oil throughout history. So it depends. Some things butter is going to taste better. Other things olive oil. It depends on what temperature of heat is getting used. Butter can handle higher temperature of heat. So there's a lot of factors that come to play. But it's not about getting one type of fat over another. If we think about our cellular membranes, we need different types of fats to make up that cell membrane. If we had cells that were just made of butter, they would be too hard, the cell membrane. If we had cell membranes that were just made of olive oil, they'd be too squishy. You want a blend of both to keep that cell membrane integrity.
That'll be good news to all those drawn butter lovers out there. Are there specific foods that that are beneficial for specific complaints? In other words, well, for instance, in our site, Spa from Scratch, a lot of our readers are very concerned about their skin.
Mm-hmm.
And other people, they have kidney conditions or liver conditions and so forth. Uh, so would you say there's specific diets that are recommended for specific types of ailments?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, our body is made up of the food that we're eating. So food really is medicine. I mean, that's one of the things at Passion Nutrition. We're not supplement based. We're food based. So when people come in, they have specific things they want. Maybe it is they want better skin, or maybe they have fatigue or blood sugar imbalances. So for each person, there can be a diet that we talk about that can help with whatever condition they're wanting, whether it's better skin or better hair or whatever it is. Because food is what makes up who we are. So it can
You
have
and I'll have to have a discussion about that better skin part. Because, in some places you'll read that, well, just eat a balanced diet, no matter what your malady is. Just eat a balanced diet and you're going to be fine.
Yeah, there's so much that you can do.
Should people, in your opinion, say, versus buying a specific vegetable fresh, buy it frozen if possible?
Well, it depends. I mean, at the grocery store, it is true that, unfortunately, many things that happen to the food aren't on the label or we're not going to know about. So, it is where we have to be detectives almost at the grocery store. Now, it is true that some things are better frozen than they are fresh. If it's shipped a long distance, for example, if it's berries in the winter, we'd be much better off having frozen berries than we would something that's getting shipped in from South America. Because the shipping time, the nutrition content really goes down versus if they're picked and frozen right away.
Just a question for you. In your studies, what would you say is the level of nutrition, say the B vitamins? How much are those degraded by time?
There's some B vitamins that go down with time. But so it's vitamin C and also some of the B vitamins that you're really going to get that loss with.
And you tend to not believe in using supplements.
Well, it's not that I necessarily don't believe in it, but like at Passionate Nutrition, we talk about food with people. We don't sell supplements, we don't recommend supplements. Now if somebody's doing that with their naturopath or with somebody else, we're not going to go against that.
Understood, yeah.
But we also believe in the power of food, like what we do at the grocery store. What are we cooking and eating? It seems like there's a lot of power in that, and that's just what we choose to focus.
Well, with Passionate Nutrition now, what would you say? I mean, no person is going to be successful with 100% of the people they deal with. But what would you say your percentage of success, your success rate is, Jennifer?
We tend to, I don't know statistically, but we have a high success rate of working with people. I mean, we're growing and expanding, and we have a lot of success with clients that we work with. I think it's really practical information that really helps to transform and change somebody's life. Because a lot of times we can buy a bottle of pills, we don't necessarily know why we're taking it, or even when the pills run out, maybe we don't refill, buy another bottle. Whereas teaching people how to listen to their body and nourish their body and eat has profound implications. I mean, this is something that can change someone's life and their family's life for years to come.
How great of a threat do you feel the residual chemicals on our fruit and vegetables that we buy in the store sold by big agribusiness should be of concern?
I think it is definitely of concern. And at the same time, I think it's easy, the more we know about nutrition, we can almost go crazy, because we learn about this and then we learn about that, and and it gets to the point where sometimes people are afraid to eat. Like, we tend to attract very educated clients, and they'll come in and they've read this book and that book, and then they've read these studies, and they say, I don't know what to eat, so I'm just eating cereal. So the thing is, I would say it is something to be concerned about and to do the best we can in terms of, as much as the budget permits, to buy, from the farmer's market, or buy from food co-ops or places that, they're having thoughtful
organic foods,
local foods. And at the same time, getting vegetables in is most important. So even if somebody doesn't have access to that, depending on where they live, or maybe their finances don't permit, still getting vegetables, even if they have pesticides or herbicides or things we don't want, still the studies that have been done show that getting the vegetables in is more important than not getting them in, even if they aren't the ideal.
Yeah, that's a good point. Are there specific foods that a person can eat that will help them eliminate ingested toxins?
Yeah, actually seaweed is a big one of those. Seaweed, anything that has a lot of chlorophyll, like spirulina is a good example, cilantro, any dark green leafy vegetables. But in particular, seaweed, cilantro, yeah, those are the two bigger ones that help bind to and get rid of toxins in our body, whether it's heavy metals or other things.
Would that include herbicides and pesticides?
In general,
yes. That's just a question, because I don't know the answer. I haven't researched that.
It can help, but it's a little bit of a roundabout process. Anything that helps our liver, any really strong liver foods help our body go through phase 1, phase 2 detox in the liver. So anything that helps our liver function more efficiently can help with the elimination of those things.
Well, that's good to know. Can the average person meet all of his or her nutritional needs through diet alone? Because you hear so much about, well, you would have to eat a bushel of this or that in order to get the nutritional value you need supplements.
Yeah, I don't believe that we need supplements. I think it is true that we have to be thoughtful as to the food choices that we're making, because some foods are definitely more nutrient dense than others. So actually that's where the seaweed can come in, because what we're often missing, or what people are talking about that we need supplements for, has a lot to do with minerals. That tends to be something that people are deficient in. And it is true, much of our food doesn't have a lot of high mineral content, but that's why adding things like wild foods into our diet, or foods that haven't been hybridized over the years, or things like seaweed, These are very, very nutrient dense foods that they're almost like a multivitamin, but in food form.
Now, is there specific wild foods that, now I know that people used to eat a lot of wild foods. In fact, in Spot from Scratch, I've got a little article there on dandelion, eating dandelion. I personally am not fond of it because it's a little bit on the bitter side. But I do know it was considered a springtime tonic in the old days.
Right. There's a lot of wild foods that you can eat. And in fact, actually, this summer, so we have the seaweed harvesting classes that we're teaching. And then right after the seaweed harvesting classes, we have wild foraging classes. So it's back to back on Lopez. And, to go hungry in the Pacific Northwest would be a shame because we're surrounded by wild foods that are very, very nutrient dense. Like even nettle is a big example. Like dandelion.
Had nettle, and nettle's good.
Nettle's great. I mean, nettle makes kale look like iceberg lettuce in terms of the nutritional content.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Like, for example, kale, 1 cup of kale has about 206 milligrams of calcium, and that's one of kale's claim to fame is calcium. If you have 1 cup of nettle, it's about 2,900 milligrams of calcium.
Is that right?
So it's really, wild foods, seaweed, wild foods, they blow away even our best, co-op, organic, local produce that we can get.
Is it better to pick the plant when it's very young, the leaves when they're very young? And I'm assuming it's the leaves you're talking about.
Yeah, the leaves when they're young. And actually, nettle has a breaking point like asparagus. So you don't want to pull it up from the roots or else it won't grow back. But if you just break it off, and you can take that and use it like you would spinach. And it has to be cooked though because it has to be cooked or dried because that's how you lose the sting in it. But also even just doing a long steep tea, where you dry the nettle leaves so it looks like oregano, and then you let it steep in water overnight, and that's a great way to get the minerals out.
Does it taste good?
I mean, it depends. I mean, it definitely is much more mild than people tend to think, but you can always add, mint or honey or whatever you want to it to make it taste the flavor you want.
To give it some flavor. Yeah, that's very interesting, Jennifer. I knew nettle was edible because I've eaten it before. I went on a wild foods binge here a number of years ago, to the disdain of my family because some of the things I didn't know how to prepare very well.
Right.
But nettle was one of them, and we thought nettle, but we're steamed green vegetable fans like spinach and kale, and so that fit right in, and we found it tasty. Here's a question for you. I know you're not into the supplements. There's natural vitamins and synthetic vitamins. Now, natural vitamins supposedly have the associated food factors with the vitamin itself. What are your views on the natural versus synthetic vitamins?
Well, if I was choosing between the two, I'd say the natural. But at the same time, I still choose food any day over supplements.
Yeah, I understand. But that was one of the questions I definitely wanted to, because a lot of times we're sold things. Not necessarily, in other words, it's marketing hype.
Right.
And you read so many contradictory views on the natural versus synthetic vitamins. I thought, well, I'll pose that to Jennifer and see what she has to say about it. Talk to me a little bit about genetically modified foods.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of genetically modified foods. And in fact, at Passion Nutrition, we've been donating regularly to the PCC initiative to label, well, it's not the PCC initiative, but they're matching any donations that are made to label genetically modified foods that's on this ballot coming up. So, yeah, definitely not a fan of GMO foods and believe in the labeling.
How do you see those genetically modified foods affecting, or what effect do you think they may have on the human body?
I don't know. I mean, there's been a fair amount of research, and the research that's out there doesn't look very favorably upon them in terms of, I mean, from reproduction to cognitive functioning. I mean, and the thing is, there's just so many unknowns. It's a big experiment, it seems like, and the research that has been done isn't good.
And we're the guinea pigs.
Mhm. Yeah.
Which is not uncommon.
Right.
You have a reputation, according to your website and the testimonials on your site, of helping people lose weight.
Mhm.
Talk to me a little bit about that. What if someone were to come to you with extra weight? What would you recommend to that person?
Well, it's so individual. It depends on what's going on for the person. There's many factors that tie into weight. In our culture, we tend to think that it's calories in, calories out, but that's just such a small part of the equation. It can be somebody's bacteria population of their body. Our bacteria outnumber our cells by about 10 times. So if our bacteria is off, then how we process food or the cravings we have will be off. It might be looking at if somebody's getting their nutrient needs met, and also depending on the time of day when they're eating, that can have an impact as well. It's very individual for the person. What works for one person with weight loss doesn't necessarily work for another person. It seems it's really trying to find, like doing that detective work to find out what's really the big culprit when somebody comes in.
How do you go about that?
Asking a lot of questions. Looking at people. There's a lot you can tell physically by looking at people, but a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm. That's back to the metabolism question.
Yeah, and just seeing...
because some people, not meaning to interrupt, but some people, it seems like they look at food and they put on pounds. Other people eat barrels of food and they're thin as rails.
Absolutely. There's no just calories in, calories out is so overly simplified. Because I think from what you're describing, we know that that's not true. We see it all the time with people. There's so many other factors to look at.
And back to the liver function again.
Liver function too, thyroid, just the whole endocrine system. How is it functioning? Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit. You hinted about this probiotics.
Mm-hmm.
How would people get a good balance of probiotics into their diets?
Eating fermented foods. Having things like sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir. Foods that have been around that have a long history. Buying them from the refrigerator section and then not heating them up. Because if they're in the aisles, that means they've been pasteurized. So the bacteria that we're looking for have been killed off.
It's gone.
So having them where they're purchased from the refrigerator and they're not heated, that's a great way to get that bacteria in. And it doesn't take a lot, 2 to 4 tablespoons a day. Just having it as part of our daily fare.
Yogurt?
Yogurt is lower on the totem pole. In terms of, there's a lot of marketing with yogurt, but the bacteria tends to be a lot lower.
A lot of people don't care for sauerkraut, for instance. I'm not one of them. I love the stuff. But so is there anything else that they can use besides the fermented foods to get these probiotics into their system? Because if for people that just don't like those kind of foods.
Yeah, there's probably something or some way that they'll like it. If it doesn't have to be a bowl of sauerkraut or kimchi alone. It's usually coupled with something. It can be in a salad. It can be on a sandwich. It takes a little fine-tuning. And sometimes, other things like fermented salsa will work, or fermented carrots. It really does need to be a fermented food to have the bacteria, or at least a raw food will have some. But if there can be some fermented food that they like, that will help.
Really help.
Mm-hmm.
But raw foods would also have, for instance, a big tossed salad.
Well, you'll get some. It's true. You'll get some with raw foods. And then things like raw milk, for example, you would get more bacteria that way. So raw foods, depending on what it is, will have some of the bacteria, but just not in as high of concentration.
I'm thinking of those people that just absolutely refuse to eat a fermented food. They just don't like it.
Yeah.
Get it in their mouth and they spit it right back out again.
Well, that might be somebody that their best choice would be to take a probiotic supplement, which it won't be as balanced or as powerful typically as a food form will, but that's another option too. And when I say that, I mean a supplement, it does have a high number of bacteria in it, but it just doesn't tend to be as balanced. Like for example, a really great probiotic supplement might have 5 to 10 strains of bacteria, whereas a traditionally made kefir will have like 40 strains of bacteria. You know, so, but in smaller quantities. You know, there just tends to be a lot more diversity in the food versus supplements. But if the food doesn't work, then I would go that route.
The bacteria, it's my understanding that the good guys will push out and control the bad guys. Is that your...
Yeah, that's mine as well.
I wanted to know, and I know I'm poking here, but I wanted to know if you would share with our readers a few of the most important weight loss tips, since obesity is such an enormous problem in the Western civilization.
Well, I would say, one, trying to eat food as close to the source as possible, like really watching out for the additives. Additives can bog down our liver, and, you know, it's just not as easy for our body to process. You know, getting enough of the bacteria in. You know, it's something that there have been studies where if you have lean mice versus overweight mice, and you switch the bacteria in their bodies, you know, then they're eating the same amount of calories that they've eaten, but the lean mice tend to gain weight, and the overweight mice tend to lose weight. You know, so our bacteria populations have a huge part to play with weight loss as well.
That's very interesting. It's very interesting. If you could, I'm assuming that what you're saying from our conversation is that the best advice you could give to our readers is to eat a good, healthy, well-balanced diet, right?
Well, not even necessarily the balanced part, because it might be different for everyone what balance looks like. So I'd say eating food that you can read all the ingredients. Like, you know what it is. It's something that your grandmother or your great-grandmother would have eaten and considered food.
What do you think about the stevia and these various artificial sugars?
Well, I'm not a fan of artificial sugars. Stevia has a long history to it. If it's minimally processed, I mean, stevia is something that's been around for hundreds of years. It's a herb that gets ground up. I mean, it can be highly processed too in its manufacturing. But artificial sweeteners in general, I just say stay away from them.
And I think that does it for the questions on the list. You did an amazingly good job.
Oh, well, thank you.